Hi, welcome to Collected Poems, Eilean in conversation with Jessica Traynor and brought to you by South Dublin Libraries as part of our Poetry Day Ireland celebrations. Be sure to check out the rest of our Poetry Day Ireland events throughout the whole day and watch back any events you've missed at South Dublin Libraries YouTube channel. Your libraries may be closed, but we're still here with a whole range of library services, and you can join online right now at www.southdublinlibraries.ie. On behalf of South Dublin Libraries, please enjoy our Poetry Day Ireland event, Jessica Traynor in conversation with Eilean Chuilleanáin.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica Traynor, and I have the pleasure of introducing Eilean Chuilleanáin for an evening of readings and discussions of her work to celebrate the release of her collected poems, an absolutely stunning book which showcases more than 50 years of the work of one of Ireland's foremost poets. Revisiting Eilean's work in this single volume, I was struck by the consistency and the coherence of the tone throughout the work. This is a poet who, to use the terrible cliche, sprung forth fully formed with the release of her debut collection, Acts and Monuments, in 1972. This consistency, paired with the immediately recognisable elegance and eloquence of Ní Chuilleanáin's voice, gifts us a body of work which is remarkably sustained. These are poems that are at once elemental, engaged with the tactile nature of the outside world, and inward-looking, giving the reader a glimpse of hidden worlds within. Journeys by water, chance encounters on the street with a frisson of attraction, hymns to the cities of Dublin and Cork, and crossings of borders, both physical and metaphysical. These are the rewards in store for the reader who travels the roads within these poems. As Gerard Smith said of the work in a recent review in the Dublin Review of Books, in Ní Chuilleanáin's work we get a sense from the forensic language that each poem is an act of excavation and recovery, the peeling away of layers to reveal certain facts, whether out of memory, encounter, observance, or actual lived experience. Eilean's work has been nationally and internationally recognised, and she is the winner of the Griffin International Poetry Prize and the Irish Times Poetry Now Award, among many others. So I'm delighted that you'll be able to join us for this evening of excavation of a wonderful body of poetic work. Eilean, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for inviting me and for having me. I'll read a few poems. These are early poems for the first half of the programme, and some of them actually go back for more than 50 years. This is what happens when you get very old. I'm going to start with a poem called Swineherd, which is one of my oldest, and it's also the one that for years and years was the only one that anybody knew. It turned up in very strange places, like on the tube in London, for example. Swineherd. When all this is over, said the swineherd, I mean to retire where nobody will have heard about my special skills, and conversation is mainly about the weather. I intend to learn how to make coffee at least as well as the Portuguese lay sister in the kitchen, and polish the brass fenders every day. I want to lie awake at night, listening to cream crawling to the top of the jug and the water lying soft in the cistern. I want to see an orchard where the trees grow in straight lines and the yellow fox finds shelter between the navy blue trunks, where it gets dark early in summer and the apple blossom is allowed to wither on the bough. The next one I'm going to read is one that I well remember writing because I wrote it when I was invigilating a Trinity examination, walking up and down between the desks. And this came into my head, and I realized how I could keep it in my head, how I could remember what the words were. It's called Celibates. One of the things about this poem is that it's been frequently misunderstood. It's about the hermits of ancient Ireland who wrote beautiful nature poetry in the wilderness. but I've met 3 people over my lifetime who thought it was about hermit crabs. So this is a warning. It's not about crabs. When the farmers burnt the furs away, where they had heedlessly lived till then, the hermits all made for the seashore, chose each a far safe hole beneath rocks, now more alone than even before. Nights darker than thickest hawthorn shade, the March wind blew in cold off the sea. They never again saw a sunrise, but watched the long sands glitter westwards. Their bells cracked, their singing grew harsher. In August, a bee strayed overboard down the high cliff, hummed along the strand. 3 hermits saw them on that long coast. One spring, the high tides stifled them all. I was writing such a long time ago that it wasn't that easy, in fact, for a woman writer to identify herself as female. If you did that, people had a tendency to say you were being shrill or strident, and certainly it switched off half your audience, or maybe not quite as much as half, but quite a large part of your audience got switched off. The next poem I'm going to read is the first one that I actually realized I had to identify myself as a female speaker. It's called The Lady's Tower, and it's also about my dislike of housework, the fact that I do as little as possible. The lady in this is a witch, so she doesn't have to do any housework. It's all done by cats and spirits. Hollow, my high tower leans back to the cliff. My thatch converses with spread sky, heronries. The grey wall slices downward and meets a sliding flooded stream, pebble-banked, small diving birds. Downstairs, my cellars plumb. Behind me shifting the oblique veins of the hill, my kitchen is damp, spiders shaded under brown vats. I hear the stream change pace, glance from the stove to see the punt is now floating freely, bobs square-ended, the rope dead level. Opening the kitchen door, the quarry brambles miss my hair, sprung so high their fruit wastes. And up the tall stairs my bed is made even with a sycamore root at my small square window. All night I lie sheeted. My broom chases down treads, delighted spirals of dust. The yellow duster glides over shelves, around knobs, bristles stroking flagstone, dancing with the spiders around the kitchen in the dark, while cats climb the tower and the river fills a spoonful of light on the cellar walls below. In that faraway time, I would spend a certain amount of time visiting the district court for complicated reasons to do with the private life of a friend of mine. And one of the things I noticed was that when you're in court, you're invisible, unless you're a lawyer or a criminal or the judge. You're somebody that people just walk past. And so this poem is called The Absent Girl. The absent girl is conspicuous by her silence, sitting at the courtroom window, her cheek against the glass. They pass her without a sound, and when they look for her face, can only see the clock behind her skull. Grey hair blinds her eyes, and night presses on the window panes. She can feel the glass cold, but with no time for pain, searches for a memory lost with muscle and blood. She misses her ligaments and the marrow of her bones. The clock chatters. With no beating heart, lung or breast, how can she tell the time? Her skin is shadowed, where once the early sunlight blazed. The next one I'm going to read is largely pinched from the Roman poet Ovid. It's called Pygmalion's Image, and it's about his version of the story where the man makes a marble statue and then falls in love with it. And the gods take pity on it, take pity on him and bring it back to life, or bring it to life. And I thought, well, supposing that wasn't such a wonderful experience for him, supposing it scared him witless. So that's what underlies this poem, Pygmalion's Image. Not only her stone face, laid back, staring in the ferns, but everything the scoop of the valley contains begins to move. And beyond the horizon, the trucks beat the highway. A tree inflates gently on the curve of the hill. An insect crashes on the carved eyelid. Grass blows westward from the roots as the wind knifes under her skin and ruffles it like a book. The crisp hair is real, wriggling like snakes. A rustle of veins, tick of blood in the throat. The lines of the face tangle and catch, and a green leaf of language comes twisting out of her mouth. This one is also, I suppose, a poem about the male and female. It's based on the Hans Andersen fairy tale, where the prince brings the princess all kinds of beautiful gifts, which he thinks are beautiful. But she doesn't want the gifts. What she wants is his knowledge. She's not interested in him when he brings the gifts. When he disguises himself as the pig boy and brings her toys that allow her to know what everybody in town is having for dinner, she becomes much more interested in him. It was his bag of tricks she wanted, surely not him. The pipkin that sat on the flame, its emissions transporting her. So she skipped from kitchen to kitchen, sampling licks of food. She knew who had bacon and who had porridge and tea, and she needed the swoop of light from his torch that wavered as she walked booted through the evening fair, catching the green flash of sheep's eyes, the glow of false teeth in the skull. Its grotto light stroked oxters of arches, bridges, lintels, probed cobbles of tunnels, where the world shook itself inside out like a knitted sleeve. Light on the frozen mesh, the fishbone curve, the threads and weights, and as day glittered on skin, she stood in the hood of a nostril and saw the ocean gleam of his eye. The next poem I'm going to read is one that has proved surprisingly popular when it became a Leaving Cert poem. Surprising to me, I'd forgotten all about that I'd ever written such a poem, I suppose. But it's about attraction, and I suppose that's something that puzzles us and interests us and draws us towards us. There really was such a girl. There was a very striking girl. She wasn't the butcher's daughter. She worked in the butcher's shop, and people did look at her. It's called Street. He fell in love with the butcher's daughter when he saw her passing by in her white trousers, dangling a knife on a ring at her belt. He stared at the dark, shining drops on the paving stones. One day he followed her down the slanting lane at the back of the shambles, A door stood half open, and the stairs were brushed and clean. Her shoes paired on the bottom step, each tread marked with a red crescent, her bare heels left, fading to faintest at the top. This poem that I'm going to read next, it's the last one in this half. It was written in a difficult time of my life because my younger sister was dying of cancer, and I was going over to London to help out with taking care of her. And it struck me at the time that this was a task that so many people have to do, but it reminded me of what happens in fairy tales, where a girl sets out to seek her fortune and takes service with an older woman who gives her a task to perform. And in this case, the task is simply to go to a well and bring back water in her hands. It's called The Water Journey. I sent the girl to the well. She walked up the main road as far as Tell's Cross, turned left over the stile and up the hill path. I stood at the door to watch her coming down, her eyes fixed on the level of the water cushioned in her palms, wavering like the circles of grain in wood. She stepped neatly down on the road. The lads on bicycles cheered as they passed her, and her fingers shook and nearly leaped and lost it. She took her time for the last 50 yards, bringing it to the threshold, and there I drank. I said to the other sisters, each of you will have to do the same when your day comes. This one has finished her turn. She can go home with her wages. She was hardly make it as far as the well at the world's end.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those poems, Eilean. It is so wonderful to hear just the kind of the span of the work and the way that your themes have developed over the course of this, the first half of the reading that you'll be doing for us this evening. And I'd just love to start by asking you, not the most original of questions, but one I think that people will be interested in, which is, when did you discover your vocation as a poet? Did poetry always come to you? Was there literature in your background? Was it something that surprised you when you first became kind of interested in writing it yourself?
Oh, it was always there because my mother was a writer and I had a great uncle who was a poet, and there was sort of an expectation that this was a normal thing to be doing. And I think my mother was a novelist, and I grew up with rather snooty notions that anybody could do that. I now realize just how much work goes into writing good prose fiction. And so I thought, everybody says poetry is more difficult, so I'll do that. It's a classic example of the the premature decision. And I think I had decided to do that when I was 10 or so, and was working at it seriously from about 14 or 15. So yes, it was always there.
But isn't that fantastic? I think the overconfidence of youth is a wonderful thing, and it's the beginning of so many wonderful artistic journeys. And thank goodness that you had that kind of sense of, well, this is the challenge that I need to set myself. So I think it's so interesting the way that we find our ways into these vocations. And I remember when I was starting off myself as a poet, Harry Clifton was very good to me, and he gave me a lot of advice. And at one stage he sat me down and said, are your parents okay with the notion of you wanting to become a poet? As if it was something kind of deeply subversive. And I said, well, Harry, my mum's an actress, so I think I've chosen one of the other least stable choices in terms of work life. But I'm glad that I did. So it's nice to know that you had a family who were very supportive, and I suppose at least aware of that world and the possibilities within that world. which is great. And just looking back to your first collection, Eilean, which just feels so fresh, and it's amazing again reading all the poems together. And I find collected poems can be challenging in terms of their size, you know, and how much work is in it. But I really did feel reading the poems from Acts and Monuments, they feel like they could have been written, you know, 20 minutes ago, as opposed to back in 1972. How did you feel revisiting these poems in terms of putting them together for the collected? How did that, what was that experience like for you?
Well, I was surprised because, as you know yourself, when you publish a collection of poems, it's a lot of work, and then it appears, and it's a little slim thing. You know, you couldn't stop a door with it. You could put it in between two other books and it would get lost. So I was rather surprised that at last there was so much that I could get a respectable door stopper.
Yes.
I think I was also surprised at how much energy and I suppose because I was so much younger, how much passion had gone into them. I was surprised at how many of them were about love. I had thought that I wasn't that kind of poet.
Yes, I think we always feel that we're being a lot more mysterious sometimes than we are in our poetry, and that we've put so many filters over it that people won't figure it out. But I think when the poetry is really working, those passions do shine through. And I was so delighted to hear how surprised you were by the notion of Swineherd appealing to so many people, because I mean it is a stunning poem, and a really beautiful poem. But I always think it's lovely to hear when writers are surprised by their own successes, because it's such an interesting experience figuring out which are the poems that speak to people. I mean, when we write them ourselves, they're all our babies and we care very deeply for them. And then to have the lovely experience of seeing the poem up there on the London Underground and things like that. But looking back at poems like Swineherd and Celibates as well, I think there's a theme that emerges in the early work, which is around, I mean, hermits are something you come back to, and we'll talk about that a little bit later after the second reading. But there's a notion of vocation, I think, in these poems, and a sense
I'm
of...
sorry.
I think I froze there. Did I? Amy, I might just go back to the beginning of that question. Amy, do you need to stop?
That's not a problem. Go ahead.
I'll just go on. So two of the poems that you read there in the first half from Acts and Monuments, Swineherd and Celibates, both of them seem to reflect on vocation and the idea of what kind of sets the artist or the observer even apart from the mundane world. And is that something that's preoccupied you throughout your work?
Not all that much. When I was growing up, vocation meant being a nun. And I had these 6 unmarried aunts, 3 of whom were nuns, and the others would have been nuns, I think. In fact, they were worse. They were much more given to prayer and piety. The nuns themselves seemed to have quite a satisfactory life. But what I found then was that I was interested in, well, yes, you did say separation. I was interested in people who live inside a world that they have chosen. And sometimes I think, well, I've chosen to live a lot of my life within a university. It's not all that different. I'm interested in space also, and nuns are very much to do with space. They're not to do with whether you're inside or outside, whether you're in the street or in the chapel or somewhere else. And I think these are things those were the things that I thought would resonate with readers, the space theme especially.
Yes, yeah, and also the idea of time passing. And I think Celibates is such a beautiful poem, and that such a short space of time we kind of witness the coming to an end of a certain Ireland, the Ireland of these hermits, and the notion of the broken bell, and the sense of them kind of fading out of existence. And I think, again, we see that a little bit in Swineherd as well, with the notion of somebody at the end of their life reflecting on the place where they might want to be. So is time that something that preoccupies you a lot, as well as space?
I think in two ways, yes. I mean, in Swineherd, I was something like 23, and I had my first my first ever job, my only ever job as an academic. And you never work as hard as you do in your first 2 years teaching. So I was feeling that sense of sometime this will be over, and won't that be nice? But it isn't quite over yet. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is that I've written quite a lot, although not always very successfully, I think, about what happens when the world moves on but you don't. The people who are left inside a world that they can't escape from, which can be very old-fashioned. And I think when I was quite young, I was thinking about, you visit somebody and they quite clearly weren't up to going to the trouble of making a cup of tea, so they'd offer you some sherry. And to think, here's somebody who's inside a world that is containing them in some sort of way. And I think politically that also happens. People get left behind.
Yes, and I think it is that sense within the poems that time is not necessarily a linear thing for everybody, and that it moves at different times, and that there's a kind of a disruption there within society between people who are experiencing one current moment and others who are kind of trapped behind. It was wonderful to hear you speaking about Street and the Pig Boy, and also the Lady's Tower. And I love the use of kind of fable and story that comes into these poems. And the way as well, the absent girl and Pygmalion's image, that you're kind of adapting language and story in order to introduce the feminine and the body into these poems in a way that is, I suppose, a little bit sly and kind of wry as well. I did like what you said about audiences at the time, and we're moving now into kind of later poems, some of which are from the late 1980s. So we're talking about a changing Ireland. But I like the way you've kind of managed to sneak these ideas into the poems in a way that is very deft. And I think might have convinced an audience of the time that you weren't going down the shrill route, as you put it yourself. And did you find the use of fable and fairy tale a useful device for that?
Well, I think I always have been interested in folklore as a subject, partly because folklore is not just about stories, it's about custom, but it's full of stories.
Yes.
Although, institutions can shut women out, folk tales and fairy tales never do. They always seem to find a space for the feminine. I think that's fairly true. Now, I won't get into it. So that's one aspect of it. I think that when I want to write a poem, it's almost as if you were trying very hard to find the right angle, like a photographer, to approach it and to approach your subject. And so the fable quite often gives you a way to see something perhaps that's further away than you could see from if you just faced it head on.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like creating your own allegories to inhabit and to kind of populate with your own language. And I love that line in Pygmalion's image about the green leaf of language emerging, about something new being made from this kind of slightly apocalyptic image of this landscape springing to life in a kind of a vivid but quite frightening way. I think that's really, really fascinating, really powerful and effective. And I was so glad to hear you speak about the water journey as well, because it's another poem that I feel is so deft and so subtle, but contains a lot of the themes that I find throughout your work, especially the use of water, and the use of water and the this kind of fable-like structure, which I was thinking of King Lear, you know, I was thinking of the three daughters as well, and each daughter kind of having to fulfill a certain role, but only one of them doing it right or going about it the right way. So, but to go back to the idea of water, it is an element that seems very present in your poems. Is that something you're aware of, or was that a discovery when you came to put the collected together?
I know I was always aware of the water. I mean, my early poems, I was in love with a marine biologist, and he was in love with the sea. So I spent an awful lot of time thinking about the sea and what it might mean to somebody. So yes, I've always been aware of it, and it is a very powerful symbol.
Yes, it is. It is. I think it's one of those elements that has the potential to be both gentle and hugely destructive, and also to be crossed over, which is such a huge part of the poems. And I'm kind of preempting myself because I think we'll have more to talk about in this vein after you read a few more poems for us. So I'll invite you to read again if you are ready.
I'll start with a poem that took me a long time to write, and which is important to me because it's called Studying the Language. And I've spent a lot of my life learning different languages or thinking about different languages, not that many, I mean, 4 or 5, and in later years, especially translating. I spent a period of my life when a lot of my friends were sick, and I'd spend my Saturdays and Sundays going from one sick house to another. And I started to write a poem about that, and it was called Visiting the Prisoners. And it didn't get me anywhere, really. It wasn't developing, and I thought, what is it that's wrong with this? And then I suddenly thought of the kind of attention that you pay when you're listening to somebody else speaking a different language. The way you notice things like some languages having a feminine form of a verb, which doesn't really show up in English or Irish. And so I suddenly, that poem, apart from the fact that I went back to hermits, and I had done that almost before I noticed it, the poem got itself written. It's called Studying the Language. On Sundays, I watch the hermits coming out of their holes into the light. Their cliff is as full as a hive. They crowd together on warm shoulders of rock where the sun has been shining. Their joints crackle. They begin to talk after a while. I listen to their accents. They're not all from this island, not all old, not even, I think, all masculine. They're so wise, they do not pretend to see me. They drink from the scattered pools of melted snow. I walk right by them and drink when they have done. I can see the marks of chains around their feet. I call this my work, these decades and stations, because without these, I would be a stranger here. This one, I talked about the poems I wrote during my sister's illness. And what I found then was that I couldn't write about her directly for a long time. This poem is called The Bend in the Road, and it's about the fact that she and I and our 2 husbands bought a house in Italy together, and we had planned this for a long time, and we had great plans for how we would share it. And then almost immediately, she became ill and died. And I still have, as it happens, I'm the only survivor of those 4 people. I still have the house, and when I'm there, I drive to the lake nearby, and I always pass a particular place where, when my son was a child, he felt sick in the car, and we stopped. And I used to drive past that place and think, what is it that makes this so important? And then I realized it seemed to sum up all the things that had happened about the place and about the house. And to allow me to speak about the various losses, because it wasn't only she who had died, it was also my mother and my stepfather. And my stepfather died 6 months before my sister did, so it was a particularly hard period in the family. So it's called the Bend in the Road. This is the place where the child felt sick in the car, and they pulled over and waited in the shadow of a house. A tall tree like a cat's tail waited too. They opened the windows and breathed easily while nothing moved. Then he was better. Over 12 years, it has become the place where you were sick one day on the way to the lake. You are taller now than us. The tree is taller. The house is quite covered in with green creeper, and the bend in the road is as silent as ever it was on that day. Piled high, wrapped lightly, like the one cumulus cloud in a perfect sky, softly packed like the air, is all that went on in those years. The absences, the faces, never long absent from thought, the bodies alive then, and the airy space they took up when we saw them wrapped and sealed by sickness, guessing the piled weight of sleep we knew they could not carry for long. This is the place of their presence, in the tree, in the air. And this is a poem about the male poets of Ireland. I was asked to write an essay about them, and I thought, this is interesting because the females always, at that stage anyway, used to get shoved in together. So I wrote the essay, and then it was never published. The book never came out. So while I was writing it, I had this dream where I could hear them all talking. And I thought, at least I can get a poem out of it. It's called a capitulary, which comes from the word capitulum, which is for the Latin for a chapter house. Now in my sleep, I can hear them beyond the wall, a chapter house growl, gently continuous. The sound the child heard, waking and dozing again. All the long night she was tucked up in the library, while her father told his story to the chaplain, and then repeated it before the bishop. She heard his flat accent, always askew, responding to the Maynooth semitones. A pause, and then the whisper of the scribe, sweeping up the Latin like dust before a brush, lining up the ablatives, a refined countrywoman's hiss, and the neuter scrape of the pen. I feel the ticking of their voices, and remember how my sister, before she was born, listened for hours to my mother practicing scales on the cello, a grumble of thick string, and then climbing to a high note that lifted its head like a seal, to a high note that lifted its head like a seal in the water. This one is called The Witch in the Wardrobe. And here it goes back actually to books that I was fond of as a child, the books of the Narnia stories of C.S. Lewis. But they're also books that I found myself teaching about much later. So I thought, this is the image that I want to use for a poem. The moment in the first, I think, of the Narnia books, where the little girl gets into a wardrobe which is full of fur coats, and he pauses on the sensation of being surrounded by the fur. And I thought, that's a pretty good image. The Witch in the Wardrobe. And so she opened the plank door where the dry palm branches had always perched, balancing lightly, pegged over the architrave. She swam at once inside a fluent pantry a grange of luxury. The silk scarves came flying at her face like a car wash, then brushed her cheeks and shoulders coolly down. The fur slid over her skin, oiled and ready, and a cashmere sleeve whispered, probing her ear, "We were here all along, like an engine idling, warm, gentle, and alert. What will you do now?" But when she closed her eyes to feel it closer, their swatch of sublime purples, intensely swooping and spinning, dived past her, cooing like pigeons, their prickling mauve inside her stretched eyelids. The bridge was gone, and beyond it, she could no longer see her body, its flesh without stain, its innocent skin. Here's a poem that has come back into some prominence because it's called The Polio Epidemic. And it's one that I was asked to write for the 50th anniversary of the polio epidemic of 1956, which when I was a young teenager, I was 13. And the polio epidemic, it was quite frightening, I suppose, but more for the parents than for the children, because it did strike younger people especially. And it suddenly meant that one's parents' habits changed. Our parents would sometimes say to you, "Why are you always stuck in a book? Why don't you go outside and play like a normal child?" And all of a sudden they wanted us to be quiet, to stay at home, and they got us lots and lots of books to read. But one day, my father couldn't really see a child on a bicycle without giving them a job to do. And he let me out one day on a promise that I wouldn't stop and speak to anybody. And it's about a kind of freedom which I think children, including girls, had in those days, which they don't have quite so much nowadays. And so it is very much a poem about that time. The polio epidemic. No hurry at all in house or garden. The children were kept from the danger. The parents suddenly had more time to watch them, to keep them amused, to see they had plenty to read. The city lay empty, infected. There was no more ice cream. The baths were closed all summer. One day, my father allowed me beyond the gate with a message to pass through a slit in a blank wall. I promised I would just cycle for 2 hours, not stop or talk. And I roamed the long roads, clear through city and suburbs, past new churches, past ridges of houses where strange children were kept indoors too. I sliced through miles of air, free as a plague angel descending on places the buses went. Commons Road, Friars Walk. This is the second last poem I'm going to read, and I think it's the longest. It's a poem that I think I had been trying to read, to write all my life. Something about the way we are fond of light, but also fond of darkness. The way sometimes light, and especially the light of industry, the light of factories, factory floors, the light of hospitals seems to repel us. It's called The Copious Dark. She used to love the darkness, how it brought closer the presence of flesh, the white arms and breast of a stranger in a railway carriage, a dim glow. Or the time the bus drew up at a woodland corner, and a young black man jumped off, and a shade moved among shades to embrace him under the leaves. Every frame of a lit window, the secrets bared, books packed warm on a wall, each blank shining blind, each folded hush of shutters without a glimmer, even the sucked sweet tones of neon reflected in rain in insomniac towns, boulevards where the odd light step was a man walking alone. They would all be kept, those promises, for people not yet in sight. Well springs she still kept searching for after the night when every wall turned yellow. Questing, she roamed after the windows she loved, and again they showed the back rooms of bakeries, the clean engine rooms, and all the floodlit open yards where a van idled by a wall. A wall as long as life, as long as work. The blighted shuttered doors in the wall are too many to scan, as many as the horses in the royal stable, as the lighted candles in the grand procession. Who can explain why the wasps are asleep in the dark in their numbered holes, and the lights shine all night in the hospital corridors? I realize I said that was the second last poem, but in fact I'm going to read two more. One of these was written for the birth of my first grandson, and that's always a great moment in anybody's life. It's called Incipit Hodie, which means it starts today, and it's about something that I think you always notice when there's a baby around, how they are already learning something about language at such a very early stage. They're learning that there are words, that words have a shape. I think that's from the very beginning. So this is for Phoenix Alexander Woods, born on the 18th of April, 2013. When you fell into our language like a fish into water, no wonder you were blinded by the splash you made. We wiped our eyes, but for you it took longer. It sprayed like feathers around you while you tried making out the noises, and slowly the stream ran calmer, though it took you a while to trust to your ears and eyes. How are you supposed to grasp the water's flow? But look, those flourishes are pebbles and fish. Fish are slipping away. The water is clear and still. When you reach for words, they will be hard, like pebbles in your hand. And this is the last poem. It's called The Morandi Bridge, and it was written about the collapse of a great piece of Italian engineering which was neglected and fell down. Unfortunately, it's the overpass that takes you across the city of Genoa, so a lot of people were killed. Let me lean my cheek against this limestone pillar. I want to press until I feel the buzzing, the sound the world makes when it isn't going anywhere, a purr of grey transparent wings hovering in one place, a humming to itself, because it needs to lie still, stay quiet, and recover, and who will bring help? The noise when the bridge fell down in Geneva, the road you and I drove along slowly, heading east behind a small Fiat, packed and weighed down with people, cake and flowers, for a mother-in-law who made a Sunday lunch. They were taking their time. It was lunchtime again each year when we reached the bridge, and the families were always on the move. So we'd drive along slowly those 15 minutes, high up over the factories and streets. I would tell you this news if the stones of the world could carry language, but after 8 months, the shock and the noise inside them still, they cannot move or even allow a message to pass through.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, Eilean. And I'm so glad we didn't miss that last poem. When you said you only had 2 left, I thought, oh no, I really hope we get the Morandi Bridge, because I think it's such a beautiful poem and a beautiful ending to this reading. If we have a few minutes more, I'd just like to ask you a couple of questions about those poems, starting with The Witch in the Wardrobe, which has always been a great favourite of mine, for the very reason that it reminded me of the C.S. Lewis books, which were great favourites of mine growing up as well. And just listening to you read it, it really illuminated the idea in it or the germ of an idea that I'm finding in it, around one of the sadder aspects of that series of books, which is that towards the end of the series of books, Lucy never loses her connection to Narnia, Lucy, who we're in the wardrobe with, but her older sister Susan does when she becomes seduced by womanly things. And there's something very interesting around that idea in your poem, that these kind of trappings of femininity, these beautiful cashmere sleeves and fur coats, they seem to have a kind of a more benign function in your poem, I think.
I suppose it's going back to that earlier stage where they're all children, and children have got this appreciation of the physical world, which somehow is seen as innocent.
Yeah.
I know he says about Susan that she's only interested in nylons and invitations, and fair enough. On the whole, I mean, there are such thing as silly young women.
Yeah.
But I wanted, interestingly enough, when I was writing that poem, I changed the sex of the person who's having the experience several times. It didn't seem to matter whether it was a man or woman. Yes,
yeah. It's just that notion of the connection to the tactile and the embodied, and the body. Yes, which I think we as we grow, we move into our heads. We move out of the body and into our heads, which of course is wonderful, but there is a loss there too. To talk a little bit about the Copious Dark, it's such a beautiful poem, and I think it does capture that kind of mysterious sense of the slightly displaced feeling we often have in modernity around our sleep patterns and waking and sleeping and artificial light. And I was thinking about the fact that one of my great ambitions over the past couple of years, which I haven't managed to do, is to go to a dark skies reserve. There are so few places in Ireland and England where you can go to actually see the night sky undisturbed by light pollution. And I wondered if you find our kind of contemporary moment, with its onslaught of the online world, the internet, social media, all of these different things. Do you think it makes it harder for us to find time to reflect and to be creative? And do you find that it impacts you in that way?
Well, I don't do social media in any shape, and I think it's partly because I can't imagine how one would have the time.
Yeah.
The other things, I think email is wonderful, and I think online research is wonderful. You can do so much now, even though I am missing being able to go to the library, and the sheer sense of being surrounded by something instead of poking in a hole, which is how I feel what I'm doing when I'm looking online. I love places where you can be in the absolute dark. It's one of the things about a house in Italy, being in the country. You come home at night and the stars are shining out and nothing is blocking them out. This is partly because it is Italy, of course, but you do feel that there's a reality there that we could lose touch with, but you could lose touch with them in a cell in a convent in 1800 just as well.
Absolutely, but I think in what I was about to say, in that instance, you probably had a choice. But that is as soon as I uttered it, it sounded like a very naive statement.
You might have had a choice, and you might not.
And listening to all of these poems again, you know, your love for and your intelligence in terms of language and linguistics comes through so much. And you mentioned about your 4 or 5 languages, and you're studying various different languages. And there's something in 2 of the poems that I picked up on in Kipit Hodie, the notion of language as pebbles, and then in the Morandi Bridge, that wonderful wish that stones could convey language, could convey messages. And is language for you a constant? Is it a comfort? And is it a way to kind of grab hold of the world, or is it something that's constantly shifting and elusive?
Well, it is, I suppose, shifting and elusive in the sense that you're on an ordinary day, I might, for example, write emails in 3 languages. So yes, there's and I often, when I'm thinking about words in one language, I realize that somehow or other I've slithered into another one. It is a big preoccupation of mine. And it's something, of course, that goes back to my family. My father was a professor of Irish. My brother is a professor of Italian. I've, in various ways, had to, I've always lived in a place where language was not simple.
Yes, and I think in a way we have lost out as a society by becoming so Anglophone and living in a world where it's so easy to simply exist within the Anglophone realm. And I mean, I feel that keenly myself. And I remember when I was starting to write, Tom McIntyre giving out yards to me about not speaking Irish or not being very good at my Irish. So it is, you do see, I think, the texture given to the work by that awareness of the English language as one cog in a much wider kind of machine of various different languages working together. And poems of yours such as Gloss, Close, Glass, I think really, really shows the kind of the you use the word slither, but the notion of the fluidity of the various languages and how they bleed into each other. And all I can do at this stage really is just to recommend to our audience members to go and get this book. It's just a wonderful, wonderful book. And I've had such a lovely time revisiting your work in chronological order, Eilean. And I'd just like to thank you so much for your beautiful readings and for your wonderful conversation. And to finish up by wishing you a very happy Poetry Day, Ireland.
Thank you, and the same to you.